This is the lecture on Mesopotamia, and what I've got on this slide is just the timeline that we will probably be going through all of these different points. Now, what I want to do for this class is to start us off with talking about a group of people called the ProtoEuphrates. And they're some of the earliest people to be doing farming in Mesopotamia. And I've given you the dates here. It's not quite clear when they finished up, so it's about 4500 BC to 3000 BC, and they're in the Neolithic. And then we move into the Sumerian period. Now here on the slide I just have early dynastic period, but that's technically the entire Sumerian period from 3000 BC to about 2340 BC. Next period of time we're going to be looking at is the Akkadian period. Very important time point in human history, ends around 2100 BC. And then, if you remember from the last lecture, the word Neo, that means new, and the NeoSumerian period is next, and that literally means when the Sumerians came in and retook control from the Akkadian people. Here's a map that you've seen before. It's the Fertile Crescent, and the city-states that we're going to be looking at are down sort of in the center right of this particular map where it says Akkad and Sumer. Okay, on to the ProtoEuphrates. Now, as you can tell from this slide, Ubaid is not only a people, but it's a place. So an Atel, in this case, is a mound. And what I mean by mound is that it's a pile of really the debris of human habitation. So sometimes these tells can be massive. And the way to sort of picture it is that, someone builds a house in the ancient world, gets knocked down, they build a house on top of that, gets knocked down, and so on over thousands of years. You have a giant debris pile. And Al-Ubaid is a place, and that's what these people are named after. Now they were discovered in a really interesting way. So people living in the in the 1800s thought that the very first people living in Mesopotamia were Babylonians. And the reason they thought that is because of the Old Testament. So the Old Testament mentions the Babylonians. But when archaeology got a start in Mesopotamia, what they discovered is that there was actually a people who lived there before the Babylonians, and these were the Sumerians. So for a while it was thought that the Sumerians were the earliest. And the Sumerians could write, so people started collecting a bunch of their texts, and they started to compare the different texts. And what they noticed is a great many words in Sumerian are one syllable. So like rock, stone, and so on. But when they started to look further into these texts, there were quite a few words that were 2 syllables or 3 syllables or 4 syllables. And so linguists popped out those multisyllabic words, put them in a list, and it turns out that a great number of them are related to farming. So linguists thought that was pretty odd. And so what they thought was going on here was that there must have been a people living in Mesopotamia who were there before the Sumerians. And so they started to do archaeology, and sure enough, that's exactly what they found. So the Ubaid people were living in Mesopotamia, and they started to farm. Then it's thought that the Sumerians sort of invaded into this area, took over the Ubaid people, and then adopted farming and adopted the language of the farming. This is some Ubaid pottery or Ubaid remains. As you can see, it's a pretty beautiful pot. You've got a nice design there. You've got a nice neck, a little flare at the top. If you're lucky, you will find pottery like this coming out of the ground, unbroken. Sometimes that's not what happens, and you can see from this slide, there's lots of little bits. Luckily, they've got decoration on them, so it's almost like putting together a puzzle. And last week, we looked at the scale. So here you've got a scale that's 15 centimeters, so you can figure out the size of these particular pieces. Okay, so let's move on to the next period, and this is something called the Protoliterate period. So the period when they're first starting to write, and this is in moving from the Ubaid period into the Sumerian period. So Protoliterate, about 3500 to 2900, and then you've got, and we're going to see this all the time, these large time frames are broken up into smaller time frames. So one part of Sumerian history is called the Early Dynastic period, and it's abbreviated ED1, so Early Dynastic 1, Early Dynastic 2, Early Dynastic 3. And dynasty just means that there are kings usually a whole string of them related in some way. So it's father-son or father-cousin or any combination, usually related. When they stop being related, like if a male has no male children, then you will get another dynasty starting. By 2700, you've got lots and lots of writing. And what I thought I'd do is talk about some of the topics that they're writing on, and I'll show you some slides of what they were actually writing on. So we know very early on Sumerians were starting to write their own histories. Now we wouldn't technically consider these things to be histories, but what they were doing is, if you've ever read the story of Gilgamesh, that's almost a history of what was happening in Sumeria, especially in the city-state of Uruk, and I'll talk about city-states in just a bit. So you've got histories. By far the most common type of writing is economic records, so records like taxes. And it's thought that taxes were probably the impetus for writing in the first place, because if you think about it, you have to pay your taxes. This happens in all civilizations. You pay your tax, you really want a receipt because you don't want the tax man to come back the next week and ask you to pay your taxes. So anyway, you've got these economic and administrative records. The other type of writing we've got is royal correspondence, and that's exactly what it sounds like. It is writing between the kings. Now here's a slide that shows you some of the things that they wrote on. So on your left is a clay tablet in the shape of a rectangle, and you can see writing on that. And this style of writing is called cuneiform, and it literally means wedge-shaped. So what you're looking at is they've got a clay tablet, they've wet it, someone has drawn nice lines, almost like what we've got on paper today, and they've taken a stylus that looks like a pencil, or sort of looks like a pencil, and then they've pressed their letters into the wet clay in these wedge-shaped forms. Now, one thing to remember is that these clay tablets weren't really meant to last forever. So what's happening here is they wrote these things down on clay. If you want to rewrite something or write something new, you wet it and then rewrite. Now, they just happen to survive today because of accidental fires. So fires burn a building down, the combination of fire and wet clay, you get fired clay. Okay, this is a picture I took at the Palace of Legion of Honor in December of 2012. I was there looking at the Marie Antoinette exhibit, and as I was walking out, I just happened to notice that there was something called a nail cone, and that's what this picture is showing you. Now these nail cones, don't think of them as nails, so they didn't use them for structures or for structural things. They were purely for decoration. And if you could lift that nail cone up and look at the head of this nail, it would almost certainly be painted. So what they did was they picked these nails up, pressed them into wet clay, and then decorated the head. Now the interesting thing for us, since we're talking about writing, is that, as you can see from this one, there's writing on the nail cone. And lots of times it's telling you important people's names. So the governor, it could tell you the king, and so on. And as you can see from the date, this is fairly old, 2250 BC, getting close to the end of the Sumerian period. All right, a good thing to talk about now is what exactly is the type of government these Sumerians had. So they had something called a city-state, and it's different from a city within a country. So a city-state is both a city and, as you can tell, a state. So in Sumeria you have all these city-states. So if you remember that map, the Fertile Crescent down in the south, you've got Ur, Uruk, Lagish, and so on. So the way to think about those is there's a city where all the government things take place and lots of people live in it, but they also control the surrounding countryside. And then within each city-state, you've got separate kings. So here on the slide, I've got separate government. Within each city-state, it's got its own economy, so they collect their own taxes, they spend the money the way they want to. There's a separate military. When you've got large numbers of these city-states, there are concentrations of wealth, so you need to protect these. And then sometimes you've got separate religion. Now this isn't the case in Sumeria. So what I mean by that is you've got a standard religion that all these Sumerians know, but in each city-state there may be a patron god or goddess, and then other Sumerians who would be visiting would know that it's the same religion. Here's an image of one of the religious buildings, and it's called a ziggurat. And it is the temple. And the way to think about these temples in Mesopotamia is they're really the center of the economy. They're sort of like the ancient bank mixed with a church. So what you've got here is a ziggurat built on a mound, and this is pretty typical in the ancient world. So people would build their religious buildings up on a high hill, and then these things would dominate. So of course you'd have all your religious functions going on in here. When you pay your taxes, you would come to the temple, and the temple priests would collect the money. So these ziggurats are very important. Here's a picture of the ziggurat of Ur, very famous ziggurat. These are made out of mud brick, and of course it rains every once in a while in Mesopotamia. So what the Mesopotamians did, or what the Sumerians did, is they tried to waterproof these buildings. And so what you find every once in a while in the layers of bricks, a coating of bitumen, which is this thick tar-like substance, which is waterproof. And if you compare the drawing at the bottom to the actual building at the top, you can see some of the material at the top doesn't exist anymore. So the drawing is sort of replicating what archaeologists think it looked like at the top. And then this image doesn't have anything to do with writing, but it's conveying a message. So here you've got a carving or a frieze from a period later than what we're talking about. This is the Babylonian period, but it's showing a woman sitting and playing a harp. So you can make a number of guesses about what's going on here. So she's obviously playing music. This is telling you something a little bit about the economy, because there has to be some money around for people to be paid to produce something like this. This is a slide showing a large number of figurines from Sumeria. And figurines are always interesting to look at. So one of the main things is that people, when they're making figurines, tend to dress them like they would dress themselves. So you can look at these, you can look at the style of clothing. If you look, most of the men on here have beards. So they've got long beards, they've got long curly hair, and so we can make a sort of extrapolate from that and say that this is probably what the Sumerians look like in their day-to-day lives. Here's just a map of Sumeria, and again you can see all these city-states, especially in the southern part of Mesopotamia. And this map is also useful because it shows us some of the modern cities. Okay, what I want to talk about just for a little bit are royal tombs that were found in the city-state of Ur, or the city-state of Ur. Royal tombs are always interesting. I mean, they can tell you some information about a society. So they're royal. So you're going to find lots of wealth in there. Now, if you think about it, royal tombs don't tell you very much about the poor people, or even about, you know, what we might call the middle class. So just be careful when you're looking at evidence from a tomb like King Tut. That's not really helping us very much in terms of what's happening in the rest of the society. Anyway, the royal tombs, very important material coming out of here. And I've asked you to watch a short video clip on the royal tombs. And what you'll see, despite what I just said, is that you've got some information found in these tombs about what the poor people were doing. So as you'll hear about, they discovered a death pit where lots of people were executed after these tombs were created. The next slide shows some material from a queen's tomb, and her name is Puabi. And I've given you her date here, 2680. She had a number of women who were executed, so they were sort of lining her tomb chamber. And it's thought that these were just sort of her household servants, and then she died. They executed them to make sure that when she wakes up in the afterlife, she's got all of her servants. But sort of getting beyond that, this is one of the more famous pieces coming out of the royal tombs. This is a lyre or a harp, and you can see that. It's one thing to remember is that this is a recreated lyre. So when they opened up the tomb, most of this was made out of wood and it just didn't survive. But the pieces that did survive were the head of the bull and then a bit of the sound box, which is in front. You can see some of the characters here. This is just a close-up of the head, and you're probably wondering, how do they know how to recreate this? Well, if you look at this slide, this is the front of the sound box. And what you're looking at are a bunch of animals sort of doing human things. And if you look at the third register down, so if you, the registers are just layers. So third register down, you see almost the exact same harp. So you see the bull head, you see the sound box in the front, and then an animal is playing this. So what they did was they took the sound box and then they recreated the harp from that. This next object is called the Royal Standard of Ur, and I've asked you to listen to a podcast about this particular object, so it'll tell you a lot more than what I'm going to here. But interesting object, not very large, still not quite sure what it was used for, but it can tell you a huge amount of what was happening in Mesopotamia during this period. And the one scene that I have here is the war scene. So you can see they've got chariots, so you know during the Sumerian period they definitely had the wheel, they had chariots, and you know it's a war scene because if you look under the horses, you can see bodies. So that's fairly typical iconography, or the way that you look at these art scenes. Okay, also out of these tombs, you've got jewelry. So this slide really should have been tied with Queen Puabi, because this is the jewelry that was found on her body. So you find bracelets, necklaces, the large string of beads that are in the center that goes from one side to the next. These were found draped over her. And then those metal pins that you can see up on your upper left, it's thought that those were something that the Romans called fibula, or fibulae for plural. They would attach your clothing together. So if you think about a Roman toga, they would put these pins through to make sure that the clothing would stay up. This is some jewelry from Queen Puabi, and what you're looking at is on your left, these are rings, and on your right, these are earrings. So you've got a little gold piece that you can clamp to keep the earring in your ear. Okay, moving on. So I want to talk a little bit about the Akkadians, especially with a man named Sargon. And then, of course, as I told you at the beginning, you've got the next period, which is called the NeoSumerian period, where the Sumerians retake control. And then we'll talk very briefly about the Babylonian period. So here's just a map. Now, I put this map up here, and what I tend to do when I'm teaching this class with a live class is I ask them to look for Akkad, which is the main city. So if you want to stop the video, look for Akkad, but before you do that, I'll tell you, you won't find it. So the thing is that the thing that's interesting about Akkad is we know it exists, or we know it existed as a city, but we don't know where it is. Most famous person, the most famous Akkadian from this period is the king named Sargon. And what you're looking at is a bust of his, and notice his nose. So his nose was not flat like that. Someone dropped this bronze statue and sort of crushed the tip of his nose. But he's important for a number of different reasons, and Sargon is considered to have created the world's first empire. And so remember we talked about city-states. So all of Mesopotamia were these city-states. What happened is Sargon, who was not a royal of royal blood, rose up in power, eventually killed the king, gathered up his army in Akkad, and he started moving southwards. And instead of just making it one giant city-state, he made an empire. And the definition of an empire is sort of hard to define, but it's controlling areas outside of where you normally would control. So he pushes south, goes all the way to the Persian Gulf. He then goes northwards. And it's thought he might have ruled all the way into parts of Turkey. So fairly large area, that's why it's considered to be an empire. And as you can see from the slide, he got rid of the city-states. And this is really important in human history, especially Mesopotamia, because later rulers will try to replicate the exact same thing. They don't just want a city-state, they want an empire. Now I also told you that the Ziggurats were really the power centers. They were the religious centers, they were the economic centers. Sargon had to control these. So what he did was he put his own people in charge of these particular temples, and then they owed their allegiance to him as opposed to a particular city. He spoke Akkadian, so he's an Akkadian, and what he did was, in his government, he said, if you're working in the government, you speak Akkadian and not Sumerian. And this is why today we've got a ton of Akkadian taxes, because he forced the government to work in this particular language. He didn't tell the common people to stop using Sumerian. So if you spoke Sumerian, you could continue, but if you wanted a job in the government, you had to speak Akkadian. And one thing that Sargon did too, now there's been trade forever in human cultures, But during this period, he realized trade could bring in a huge amount of wealth. And so trade became, as I see on the slide, the main source of revenue for Sargon. And again, this had major repercussions for later history. So he makes the first world's empire, then all the rulers after want to do the same thing. He makes trade the most important part of the economy, and so all the rulers after him need to work on trade. So this next slide is showing, I think he's a grandson of Sargon called Naram Sin, and this is a stele, a victory stele. And so what you're looking at is on the left is most of the stele, and on the right is just a close-up. And so a few things to note about this. So you can tell it's taking place on a mountain. So if you look at those two characters, one has been stabbed, another one is probably praying for his life, you can see a peak there. This is happening in the mountain, and you can tell who the king is because he's bigger. So you know that Naram Sin, he's like almost twice the size of everybody else. So this is a standard feature in Mesopotamian iconography, and we'll see the same thing in Egypt. So he is taking his troops up to a mountain region, and he's taking these people over, or something else is going on here. Maybe he's protecting some area and these people were rebels. So if you look at the right side, it just shows the close-up. And again, I just mentioned this, you've got one guy being stabbed in the throat, and if you look directly below him, there are people who have also been killed, and they're probably just being tossed off the hill. You've got another guy standing there probably begging for his life. Now, if you think about Mesopotamia, and if you can't read Akkadian, you're probably wondering what this is showing. So Mesopotamia in the plains, so in the southern part, is flat. There's hardly any natural resources there, so no wood, no metal. Now, but in the north, where you've got the Taurus and Zagros mountains, you've got wood and you've got metals. So it's possible that what Naram Sin is doing here is he has some rebellions, and he is invading or reconquering this territory to make sure the trade flows, or he's invading a new territory. Okay, so the Akkadians didn't rule for very long, and then you've got a period called the NeoSumerian period. And this is when the Sumerians retake control. So it's unfortunately it's got a couple different names: the Third Dynasty of Ur, the Sumerian Revival, and I've given you the dates here. The only one person I'm going to talk about during this period is a man named Ur-Nammu, and he's known for his law code. So law codes, if we have them from the ancient world, are always really interesting because they can tell you quite a bit about the culture itself. So we've got some of Ur-Nammu's laws, and the one thing I just wanted to mention briefly here is that you've got various crimes listed and then the punishments. So what's interesting is that you do find some capital punishment, so you're put to death for certain things, but in general that law stresses payment. So if you commit a crime, you pay some type of wealth, and then you're free. So Ur-Nammu is different from Hammurabi, who we're going to talk about next. So Ur-Nammu's law, punishment is based on wealth. Now, as you can tell from the dates, the NeoSumerian period didn't last that long, about 100 years. You've got another group of people invading into this territory called the Amorites. And the Amorites are the Babylonians. So they're invading sometime around 2000. And if you look at this map, you can see the extent of their control. What the Neo-Sumerians tried to do is build a wall in the north. And if you look at this map where the Tigris and Euphrates are sort of coming together, right where it says Babylon, they tried to build something called the Amorite Wall. And this wall was supposed to work to keep these Amorites out. But, walls usually don't work like that. So the Amorites or the Babylonians invaded, and then they took over. And just really briefly, the most famous Babylonian king is Hammurabi. And he's famous because of this stele. So on the left is the entire, well, it's not the entire stele, it's most of the stele. And then again on the right, I put a close-up here. So this stele, if you look on the left, you can see something that looks different, and what that is, it's writing. And so this stele has about 280 laws, a fairly long introduction, a fairly long conclusion, and what I want you to do is read the Code of Hammurabi, the Law of Hammurabi, which is in your primary text reader, and you'll understand this much better. Now look at the right. So what's happening here is Hammurabi is receiving a law from a god named Shamash, and Shamash is sitting down. and he's the sun god. So if you look at his shoulders, you can see little rays coming out of these. Shamash is passing a staff to Hammurabi, and the staff represents the law. And then Hammurabi is taking this law, he's writing it down on the stele, and then laws are written down so that everyone can know the law. Now, not everyone would read, but this was set up in front of a temple, and then the temple priest would come out if he had a question about the law. Now, really quickly, focus on the right side with Shamash giving the law to Hammurabi. I'm hoping as you think about this, you realize this is a fairly common theme. So think about Moses. So Moses is receiving the law from the Old Testament God. It's the same type of idea. So the laws of the Hebrews are God-given. The laws of the Babylonians are also God-given. And then this is just a close-up of some of the writing, the Babylonian script, and once again, it's cuneiform. Okay, I'm not going to talk very much. I'm not going to give you the summary here on the slide. I'll let you look at that. You can just stop the video and read through it. But we talked about a number of different things. So the types of government, remember, city-states, and then this change with Sargon. You've got important parts about the economy, with trade being a big part of it, especially when you get to Sargon. We didn't totally talk about religion here, but Mesopotamian religion was very important to the people there. I mostly focused on what was happening during the time of Sargon again, where he takes control of the temples. And then cultural context. We didn't totally talk about that, but whenever you think about trade, think about the fact that it's not just goods and services that are being traded, but it's ideas.